There is growing concern for the rapid decline of social skills as new generations pioneer navigating through a technology-dominated upbringing. Mental health issues are on the rise, and just last year, Australia's cohort of schoolboys produced our worst NAPLAN results ever. To make matters worse, a whole generation of students were forced to trade classrooms for homeschooling, and it is feared it may have exacerbated the issue. Joining us live with more on this is a Professor of Sociology at La Trobe University, Professor John Carroll. Professor Carroll, thanks for your time. I was interested to read your piece about this in The Australian today. We're all just coming out of 7 or so weeks of school holidays around the country. Screen time would have been a big part of those long days for a lot of younger people. From your examination of these trends, what do you see as the psychological consequences?
Well, we've got a lot of data coming out of the United States from a decade ago after the arrival of the smartphone and the sort of rapid spread of social media from 2007 onwards. And the response there was a marked rise in depression and anxiety in teenagers. The depression rates in girls doubled in the period soon after this, and suicide rate also doubled. Now, I think the Australian figures are not as dramatic as that. But, you know, common sense tells you that if teenage boys, which is very common here now, are spending 6 to 9 hours gaming online, and some of them even longer, they're basically closing down their social interactions. And one of the consequences of that is that in the process of growing up, a child needs the hurly-burly of society, of interaction, of discussions, of argument. It's a sort of a bit like building up psychological antibodies, just like the body needs antibodies to stave off illness. In growing up, you need sort of social antibodies so that, you know, when you move out into the adult world or go to university, you're not hypersensitive to, for example, people with different opinions or sort of heated discussions about issues on which you feel strongly. One of the consequences of this in universities here and much more in the United States is that the universities have introduced what's come to be called safetyism, where they more and more censor what can be said in public, openly in the university or in the classroom, because of a fear that there's going to be a scandal about people saying things that are shocking. Now, growing up in this environment with less sort of real experience and a sort of retarded development that comes with this means, and when we've seen this, that more and more teenagers are starting to find opinions as violent opinions they don't agree with, and they're separating people they agree with into the good and those they don't agree to into the bad. And in this climate, universities and other institutions, schools will probably be following suit. Are setting up, a bureaucratizing a whole system of regulations and committees to basically censor free speech, public engagement. And at that point, universities especially, I think, are sort of changing their environment, changing the university to suit what they fear are the sensitivities of their students, rather than addressing those sensitivities and sort of maturing or providing an environment which will help the students become more mature and more open to sort of life in adult society.
So, Professor, what do you see as a solution here? We've been reporting over the last couple of weeks that a lot of schools are now banning smartphones. Is that a good step towards a solution, or is it much bigger than that? I mean, I guess most parents, if they're honest, would probably admit that they're not role modelling ideal screen time usage themselves.
Well, the parents are obviously crucial in this. I mean, I was hearing just a few days ago in a primary school, a boy reported to his teacher that he was on gaming 6 to 7 hours a day, and at weekends 10 to 11 hours a day. Well, that's clearly an issue of parenting. Schools banning phones obviously is very important. It's not the whole solution though, because kids are smart. They have iPads in class, and In primary school, I've heard cases where the boys just simply surreptitiously game while the class is going on without the teacher being aware of the fact. Now, we will develop ways of controlling that too. I think, and we can't gauge the exact ratios of this, the COVID years have exacerbated what was a growing problem anyway, in that clearly homeschooling meant that school children were more dependent on their devices, and parents were less able to supervise in many cases than teachers at school. And this sort of psychotherapist services and mental health institutions all report a very significant increase in mental health issues amongst Australian teenagers through the COVID years. Now, it's pretty clear this whole trend is very troubling. I mean, I conclude it's important not to get excessively agitated about new devices. I mean, I've reminded the audience that when the telephone arrived, there was shock, horror, scare that this was the end of socialising. But we learned pretty quickly with the telephone that the telephone just helped people do what they did anyway, but do it more frequently and more efficiently. And the arrival of television didn't bring the end of the world either, and there were massive fears at that time. So I think we've got to be cautious about new moves like the great amount of screen time on social media. The healthy reaction was that we'll adapt, that people will cut back the majority of people will cut back the amount of time they spend on the screen, on the smartphone or whatever it happens to be, return to the pleasures of socialising, and there'll be a sort of natural equilibrium will come. And I mean, I think a reasonably sensible, stable country like Australia, that's more likely to be the outcome. But there are going to be major problems of an unforeseen sort, because we don't really know the long-term consequences of living your life on a screen. We don't know the long-term consequences of that. So at the margins, and maybe wider than the margins, I think there are real harms that are coming.
Professor John Carroll, I think it's really an important conversation to have, and I really appreciate you joining us with your insights. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.